He laughed at the divorce papers, thinking she'd never truly leave. But when he saw the baby crib in the next room, his world stopped. Now he'll do anything to win back the family he never knew he had. Section 1. The sound of rain pattering against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the luxurious gray tower penthouse filled the air, but inside, the atmosphere was eerily still. The elegant suite, which once radiated warmth and passion, now felt as cold as the man sitting behind the massive oak desk. Daniel Gray, CEO of Gray Enterprises, leaned back in his leather chair, his sharp blue eyes skimming over the papers that had been neatly placed before him. Divorce papers. For a moment, his expression remained unreadable, his sculpted features betraying nothing. Then, a low chuckle rumbled from his chest, a humorless sound filled with disbelief. His fingers drummed against the mahogany desk as he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You can't be serious, Claire." Across from him, Claire Reynolds, soon to be Claire Reynolds again if things went as she planned, stood stiffly, her slender frame tense. Unlike Daniel, she wasn't amused. Her brown eyes, once filled with warmth and adoration whenever she looked at him, were now guarded. They held a quiet strength, but beneath it, there was something else, something even Daniel, who prided himself on reading people, couldn't quite place. She was different now. Gone was the woman who used to wait up for him at night, worried about his long hours at the office. Gone was the woman who fought to be heard in a marriage where she always came second to the empire he was building. This Claire, standing before him in her simple white dress, was resolved. She had already let go. "I am serious, Daniel," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "I want a divorce." Daniel scoffed, tossing the papers aside like they were nothing more than an inconvenience. "You want a divorce?" He leaned forward, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. "And what? You think I'm just going to sign these and let you walk away?" "Yes," Claire replied simply. His jaw clenched. "You can't just decide to leave after everything." "After everything," she repeated, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "That's the thing, Daniel. There is nothing left. Nothing but an empty marriage where I spent years waiting for you to remember that I exist." Daniel's fingers curled into a fist, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Claire, this is ridiculous. We don't just throw away our marriage over a rough patch." She let out a quiet breath, shaking her head. "A rough patch? Daniel, we've been married for 3 years, and I can count on one hand the number of times you've prioritized me over your work. It's not a rough patch, it's who you are." Daniel's lips parted as if he wanted to argue, but no words came out. He wasn't the type to explain himself, not to anyone. He was a man who made decisions, not someone who begged or pleaded. Yet something about Claire's unwavering stance sent a chill down his spine. She wasn't bluffing. "You don't even love me anymore," Claire continued, her voice softer now, almost wistful. "Maybe you never did." Daniel's entire body tensed. "That's not true." "Isn't it?" She tilted her head, searching his face. "Because I've spent years waiting to hear those words from you, but they never came." A beat of silence stretched between them. Daniel wasn't a man who spoke about feelings. He built empires. He controlled boardrooms with a single glance. He crushed competition without hesitation. But love? He had never been taught how to express it, not in a way that made sense to someone like Claire. She gave him everything, her patience, her kindness, her unwavering support, and he had taken it all without realizing she would one day run out of things to give. Daniel clenched his jaw, his pride refusing to let him break. "So that's it? You've already made up your mind?" Claire swallowed hard, but she nodded. "I have." He studied her for a long moment, searching for any hesitation, any crack in her resolve. He found none. Finally, he exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. "Fine," he said coolly, picking up the divorce papers again. "You want a divorce? You'll get one." Claire's breath hitched slightly, but she nodded. "Thank you." She turned to leave, her heart pounding with every step she took toward the door. She had expected him to fight her on this. She had expected him to argue, to demand more time, to remind her of all the ways she was walking away from a life others would kill for. Instead, he had let her go. It hurt more than she wanted to admit. Just as she reached for the doorknob, Daniel's voice cut through the silence. "What about the house?" Claire paused but didn't turn around. "You can keep it." "And the cars?" "I don't want them." Daniel's brow furrowed slightly. "You're not taking anything?" She let out a small breath. "No, Daniel, I don't want anything from you. I just want to be free." Her words stung in a way he hadn't expected. For a long moment, he said nothing, then finally nodded. Fine. Claire opened the door, stepping into the dimly lit hallway. For the first time in years, she felt the weight on her chest begin to lift. But just as she was about to take another step, Daniel spoke again. His voice was softer this time, almost hesitant. Is that really all? She froze, gripping the strap of her purse. There it was, the one question she had been dreading. Was that really all? She could lie. She could say yes and walk away, never looking back. But the truth sat heavily in her heart, pressing against her ribs. Daniel didn't know. He didn't know about the secret she had kept for nearly a year. The one thing she hadn't told him, not even when she had made the decision to leave. Her grip on the doorknob tightened. Yes, she whispered, though the word felt like a betrayal. That's all. And with that, she walked away, leaving Daniel Gray alone in his office with nothing but divorce papers and the sound of rain echoing against the glass. But what Claire didn't know, what she couldn't have predicted, was that hours later, Daniel would find the one thing that changed everything: a baby crib, tucked away in the room she once used as her private study. Empty now, but filled with enough unspoken words to bring Daniel Gray to his knees. Section 2. The silence in Daniel Gray's penthouse was deafening. For the first time in years, he found himself unable to focus, not on work, not on his usual routine, not on anything other than the small, untouched crib sitting in the dimly lit corner of Claire's former study. His fingers curled into tight fists at his sides as he took slow steps toward it. The pristine white paint, the neatly folded baby blanket draped over the railing, the tiny stuffed bear resting against the soft mattress. It all felt so painfully out of place. A child, his child. A wave of disbelief washed over him, followed by something far more potent: anger. Claire had kept this from him. His breath came out in sharp, uneven exhales as he tried to process what this meant. She had stood in his office just hours ago, asking for a divorce, looking him dead in the eye while pretending there was nothing left between them. She had told him she wanted nothing from him, that she wanted to be free. And yet here was the truth she hadn't spoken. Daniel's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. How long had she known? How long had she been carrying this secret? Had she ever planned on telling him? Or was she truly ready to disappear without a trace, leaving him in the dark forever? His hands trembled as he reached out, brushing his fingers against the soft fabric of the baby blanket. It was small, impossibly small, meant for a newborn. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. How could she do this? His body tensed as memories flooded back, memories of late nights when Claire had waited for him, of the quiet disappointment in her eyes when he chose work over dinner, of the way she had slowly started pulling away while he remained oblivious to the cracks forming between them. Had he been so consumed by his business, by his ambition, that he had failed to see what was happening right in front of him? The answer was clear, yes, and now it was too late. Daniel's fingers curled around the edge of the crib, his grip tightening. He had lost her. Claire was gone. But their child still existed. A bitter taste filled his mouth as he clenched his jaw. He would not lose his child, too. Claire leaned her forehead against the cool surface of her car's steering wheel, her hands gripping the leather tightly. Her heart still pounded erratically, her chest tight with the overwhelming weight of what had just happened. She had expected a fight. She had expected Daniel to throw her divorce papers back in her face, to refuse, to argue, to remind her in that cold, arrogant tone of his that no one left Daniel Gray. But he hadn't. Instead, he had laughed, and then, within minutes, agreed. Claire squeezed her eyes shut, trying to ignore the sharp ache in her chest. It was what she had wanted, what she had prepared herself for, and yet it still hurt. For years, she had held on to hope. Hope that one day Daniel would see her, that one day she would matter as much as his billion-dollar deals and high-stakes meetings, that one day he would wake up and realize that love wasn't just something to be placed on the back burner. But that day had never come, and now she was done waiting. Taking a deep breath, Claire forced herself to sit up, wiping the stray tear that had slipped down her cheek. She wouldn't cry over him anymore. She had made her choice, and she would stand by it. Her child was all that mattered now. Glancing at the time on her phone, she quickly composed herself before starting the car. She had one last stop to make before leaving the city for good. She had to protect what was left of her future. Daniel sat in the back of his sleek black car, his elbow resting against the edge of the window as he stared out at the city skyline. The driver didn't speak, sensing the heavy tension rolling off him in waves. His mind was elsewhere, fixed on Claire, on the baby, on everything he had just discovered. He needed answers. Pulling out his phone, he dialed a number, barely waiting for the person on the other end to pick up before speaking. "Find her." There was a brief pause, then a familiar voice answered. "Claire?" "Yes," Daniel bit out, his voice sharp. "She left my penthouse an hour ago. I need to know where she's going, who she's meeting, everything." His private investigator hesitated. "Sir, with all due respect, are you sure that's the route you want to take? If she's filing for divorce, she has every right to her privacy." Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. "She's pregnant." Silence and then a low exhale. "I'll find her." Daniel ended the call, his jaw clenching as he leaned back against the seat. He wouldn't let her disappear. She had taken everything from him once. He wouldn't let her take his child too. Claire stepped into the dimly lit office, clutching the envelope in her hands. Across the desk, a middle-aged lawyer, Mr. Bennett, adjusted his glasses before looking up at her expectantly. "Miss Reynolds," he greeted, offering a kind smile. "I understand you're finalizing some legal matters today?" Claire nodded, sliding the envelope across the desk. "Yes, I need these signed and processed as soon as possible." Mr. Bennett took the papers, skimming through them before his brow furrowed. "Custody papers?" Claire swallowed hard. "Yes." He looked up at her, his expression carefully neutral. "May I ask why you're filing for sole custody before the child is even born?" She exhaled shakily. "Because I don't want him to have any legal claim over my baby." The lawyer's lips pressed together, clearly hesitant. "Miss Reynolds, I must advise you that filing for sole custody under these circumstances, especially without notifying the father, can be complicated. If Mr. Gray decides to contest this, it could turn into a very difficult legal battle." Claire's stomach twisted. She had feared as much, but she had no choice. "I understand," she said quietly, "but I need to do this before he finds out." Mr. Bennett hesitated a moment longer, then nodded. "Very well. I'll prepare the necessary documents." Claire let out a slow breath, relief washing over her. She would protect her child, no matter what. What she didn't know was that Daniel was already one step ahead of her, and he had no intention of letting her go without a fight. Section 3. The night was restless for Claire. She lay in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling, unable to silence the racing thoughts in her mind. Filing for sole custody had been the hardest decision she had ever made, but she had no choice. Daniel had already taken too much from her. His neglect, his coldness, his complete disregard for their marriage. It had broken her beyond repair. She wouldn't let him break their child, too. Her hand instinctively rested on her stomach. No matter what happened, she would protect this baby. She had spent years feeling invisible to Daniel, reduced to nothing more than the woman who stood by his side while he conquered the world. He had never truly seen her, never truly valued her. But this child would. This child would know love, warmth, and security. Claire turned on her side, squeezing her eyes shut, willing herself to sleep. She needed rest. She needed strength. Tomorrow she would finalize everything and leave this life behind for good. But fate had other plans. Daniel sat at his desk, his fingers drumming impatiently against the polished mahogany surface. The city skyline stretched beyond his office window, but his attention was fixed solely on the file sitting in front of him. Claire's whereabouts. His investigator had done his job well, too well. The report was detailed with timestamps, addresses, and even a photograph of her walking into a lawyer's office. The moment Daniel saw the bolded title at the top of the page, his entire body went rigid. Petition for sole custody. A sharp, bitter laugh escaped him. She thought she could erase him from his own child's life. His jaw clenched and he pushed the file aside, standing abruptly. He had been prepared for many things, for a fight, for anger, for resistance, but not for this. Not for Claire to completely shut him out before he even had a chance to prove himself. She was making a mistake, and he wasn't going to let it happen. Grabbing his coat, he stormed out of his office, his mind made up. It was time to pay Claire a visit. Claire was in the kitchen when the loud knock echoed through her apartment. Her entire body tensed. No one came to visit her this late, and she had a sinking feeling she already knew who it was. Taking a slow breath, she moved toward the door, her heart pounding against her ribs. She hesitated for only a second before unlocking it, and there he was, Daniel Gray stood in the dim hallway, his expression unreadable. His tailored suit was pristine as always, but his eyes burned with an intensity she had never seen before. For the first time in years, he looked unhinged. Claire swallowed hard. "What are you doing here?" Daniel stepped inside without an invitation, his towering presence swallowing the small apartment whole. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" Claire's blood ran cold. He knew. Panic threatened to consume her, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Find out what?" Daniel's eyes darkened. "Don't play games with me, Claire. You filed for sole custody." Her stomach twisted. "That's none of your concern." His laugh was sharp and humorless. "None of my concern? You're carrying my child and you think I have no say?" Claire's fingers clenched into fists at her sides. "You don't get to pretend you care now, Daniel. You had your chance. You wasted it." Something in his expression flickered. Something raw, something vulnerable, but it was gone in an instant. "You never even gave me a chance," he accused, his voice dangerously low. Claire let out a bitter laugh. "A chance, Daniel. I waited for you. I begged for you to see me, and you never did." Silence stretched between them. She could see the battle waging behind his stormy blue eyes. The man who had once been untouchable, emotionless, was now standing in front of her, struggling to find the right words. But she wasn't going to give him an opening. "You don't get to barge in here and demand things from me," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm done, Daniel. I'm done waiting. I'm done fighting." Daniel's jaw tightened. "So what? You were just going to disappear, take my child and leave?" Claire lifted her chin. "Yes." The sheer finality in her tone sent a crack through his composure. For years, Claire had always been the one to hold on, the one to try. Seeing her now, cold, distant, utterly detached from him, made something inside him snap. His voice dropped softer this time. "Claire, you don't have to do this alone." She shook her head, her resolve unwavering. "I've been alone for a long time, Daniel. The only difference now is that I've finally accepted it." Daniel felt something he hadn't in years, fear. Fear that he had truly lost her. His entire life had been built on control, on structure, on logic. But this was chaos, and for the first time he had no idea how to fix it. Claire turned away, her arms wrapping protectively around her stomach. "Please leave." But Daniel didn't move. Instead, he did something completely unexpected. He dropped to his knees. Claire's breath caught. "Daniel." His hands curled into fists against the hardwood floor. "Tell me what I have to do." She froze. "What?" His gaze lifted to hers, burning with desperation. "Tell me what I have to do to fix this. To fix us." Claire's throat tightened. She had spent years dreaming of this moment, of Daniel finally seeing her, of him finally fighting for her. But it was too late, and she forced herself to look away. "There's nothing you can do." Daniel inhaled sharply, as if the words physically hurt him. But he wasn't giving up. Not this time. His voice was hoarse when he spoke again. "I'll fight for my child, Claire." She closed her eyes, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I know." And that was what terrified her the most. Daniel Gray wasn't a man who lost, and she had no idea how to stop him. Section 4. Claire stood in the dimly lit living room long after Daniel had left, her mind spiraling in 100 different directions. She had expected anger. She had expected him to lash out, to threaten legal action, to throw money at the situation like he did with everything else in his life. But she hadn't expected him to kneel. The image was seared into her mind. Daniel Gray, ruthless, untouchable, always in control, had been on his knees before her, asking what he had to do to fix this. But it didn't change anything. She couldn't let it change anything. With a deep breath, she walked into the nursery, the same room that had stopped Daniel cold when he first saw it. The crib stood against the far wall, soft blankets folded neatly inside. She ran her fingers along the wooden railing, her heart tightening. This baby was all that mattered now, not Daniel, not the past, not the feelings she was trying so desperately to bury. Daniel wasn't sure how he had made it back to his penthouse. The drive had been a blur. His mind was still trapped in that moment, Claire standing in front of him, looking at him like he was already a memory she had long since buried. And the worst part? He deserved it. For years he had convinced himself that Claire had left because she was weak, because she couldn't handle his world. It had been easier to believe that than to admit that he had pushed her away. But now, staring at the cold emptiness of his home, He saw the truth. She hadn't abandoned him. He had abandoned her. He had let his work consume him, had let his fear of emotional vulnerability turn him into a man who saw love as a liability. And now he was paying the price. With a frustrated growl, he shrugged off his suit jacket and poured himself a drink. The whiskey burned down his throat, but it did nothing to drown out the crushing weight of realization pressing down on him. He had to fix this, not just for the child, for Claire, for himself, but how? Claire sat in her lawyer's office the next morning, gripping the edge of her chair. "You're sure about this?" her attorney, Julia Lane, asked, adjusting her glasses as she studied the custody papers. "Yes," Claire nodded. "I want full custody." Julia sighed, tapping a manicured nail against the desk. "Daniel Gray isn't the kind of man who walks away quietly, Claire. He has power, influence, and more money than he knows what to do with. If he fights this, it won't be easy." "I don't care." Claire's voice was firm. "I don't want his money. I don't want his name on my child's birth certificate. I just want to move on." Julia hesitated. "Then you need to be prepared for a war." Claire's heart clenched. She already was. Daniel stood in his office, staring at the legal document in his hands. Custody petition, full soul. She was really trying to erase him from his own child's life. A bitter smile ghosted his lips. He should have expected it. Claire was nothing if not stubborn, but she was wrong if she thought he would step aside and let her dictate how this played out. His intercom buzzed. "Sir, your lawyer is here," his secretary announced. "Send him in." A moment later, Mark Stevenson, one of the best attorneys in the country, walked in, setting his briefcase on the desk. "You saw the petition?" Mark asked, getting straight to the point. Daniel nodded, tossing the papers onto the table. "I'm not signing." Mark smirked. "Didn't think you would. I want a strategy." Daniel leaned forward, his voice steel. "I don't just want visitation. I want joint custody." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure that's going to be a battle? If Claire fights hard enough, you could end up in a prolonged court case that makes headlines." "I don't care about headlines." Mark studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right, then we start by proving you're serious about being a father." Daniel exhaled sharply. "How?" "You need to show the court that you're involved, that you're capable of being a hands-on parent." Daniel's stomach tightened. He had no idea how to do that, but he would learn, because losing wasn't an option. Claire walked into the cafe near her apartment, exhaustion weighing heavily on her. She had spent the entire morning making sure her financial situation was stable enough to cover her pregnancy and the baby's first few years without Daniel's money. She could do this. She had to do this. But the moment she reached the counter, the barista gave her a sheepish smile. "Your order has already been paid for." Claire blinked. "What?" The barista gestured toward the far end of the cafe. And there he was, Daniel, sitting at a table waiting. Claire clenched her jaw, her pulse spiking. She grabbed her coffee and marched over, glaring down at him. "What the hell are you doing here?" Daniel looked up, completely unbothered. "Buying you coffee." Claire's fingers tightened around the cup. "I don't want your coffee." "Well, it's yours now." She exhaled sharply, setting the cup down. "What do you want, Daniel?" He leaned back, his gaze sharp. "I want you to stop shutting me out." Claire scoffed. "Oh, I'm sorry. Did you want to be included in the part where you neglected our marriage? Or the part where you ignored me for years?" Daniel's expression flickered. "I was a fool, Claire." "You were worse than a fool," she bit out. "You were a man who took me for granted." Silence stretched between them. Then softly, Daniel said, "I want to make it right." Claire's breath hitched. For a split second, she almost believed him, but then she remembered how many times she had begged for his attention in the past. "You're only doing this because of the baby." Her voice was cold, detached. "Not because you care about me." Daniel's eyes darkened. "You think that's true?" Claire crossed her arms. "Isn't it?" Daniel stood, closing the distance between them. "You have no idea what's true, Claire." Her throat tightened. She didn't want this. She didn't want to feel anything for him anymore. But as he stood there, looking at her with something dangerously close to regret, she felt the walls she had built start to crack, and that scared her more than anything. "Stay away from me, Daniel." She turned and walked out of the cafe, her heart pounding, but she knew, deep down, he wasn't going anywhere, and neither were the feelings she had spent so long trying to bury. Section 5. Claire slammed the door behind her the moment she stepped into her apartment, her hands trembling as she set the coffee cup down on the kitchen counter. Daniel was relentless. She should have known. She had seen him negotiate billion-dollar deals without so much as blinking. She had watched him outmaneuver entire industries, leaving his competitors scrambling to catch up. He didn't lose, and now he had set his sights on her, on their child. Claire took a deep breath, pressing a hand against her stomach. She couldn't let him get inside her head. She had fought too hard, built a life for herself from the ashes of their failed marriage. But the way he had looked at her in that cafe, like she was still the only thing that mattered. She shook her head, pushing the thought away. It didn't matter. Love wasn't enough. Not when trust had been shattered beyond repair. Daniel sat in his penthouse, staring at the custody documents on his desk. He had spent the past few days researching everything he could about parental rights, trying to understand what he was up against. Claire wanted full custody. She wanted him out of their child's life completely, and the thought of that, of missing first steps, first words, of not being there for every milestone, made his stomach turn. He couldn't let that happen, and he wouldn't. His phone buzzed, and it was Mark, his attorney. "We have a problem," Mark said the moment Daniel answered. Daniel leaned forward. "What is it?" "Claire hired one of the best custody lawyers in the city. She's preparing for a full-scale legal battle." Daniel exhaled slowly. He should have expected this. Claire never did anything halfway. "She's serious," Mark continued. "And if she plays this right, she might win." Daniel clenched his jaw over his dead body. "Then we fight," he said. Mark hesitated. "There's another way." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "I'm listening. Convince her that co-parenting is in the best interest of the child. Show her that you're capable, that you're involved." Daniel ran a hand down his face. It wasn't that simple. Claire didn't trust him. And why should she? He had ignored her, taken her love for granted, pushed her away until she had no choice but to leave. Why would she believe he had changed? Claire wasn't surprised when she received the email from Daniel's attorney. He wanted joint custody. She could already picture him, calm, calculated, treating this like another business transaction. She hated that. Hated that he could sit in his high-rise office completely unfazed, while she was drowning in emotions she didn't want to feel. She closed her laptop and sighed. There was only one solution. She had to prove that Daniel wasn't fit to be a father. And to do that, she had to make sure he saw exactly what being a parent meant. The sleepless nights, the exhaustion, the sacrifice, and let's see if the great Daniel Gray could handle that. Daniel wasn't sure what he expected when he arrived at Claire's apartment the next evening. But it wasn't her standing in the doorway with an overnight bag, arms crossed. "What's this?" he asked. She handed him the bag. "You want to be in this child's life? Fine, prove it." Daniel frowned. "What are you talking about?" "You're spending the night here with me, in this apartment." Daniel blinked. "You want me to stay here?" Claire smirked. "Isn't that what you wanted, to be involved?" Daniel studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Fine." Claire stepped aside, letting him in. "This isn't your penthouse," she warned. "No assistants, no catered meals, no board meetings to run to." Daniel rolled up his sleeves. "I can handle it." Claire arched an eyebrow. "We'll see." 3 hours later, Daniel was ready to admit defeat. Claire had made sure of it. First, she made him put together a crib. A crib. He had built multi-million-dollar companies from the ground up, but a few wooden planks and screws had left him completely at a loss. Then, she made him sit through an entire online parenting class. Then, she handed him a bottle and made him practice feeding a baby doll. It was humiliating. But worse than that, it was terrifying, because this wasn't a game, this was real. A tiny, fragile human being was coming into the world, and he was supposed to know how to protect it. What if he failed? Claire watched him struggle with a mixture of amusement and something else, something softer, something he didn't deserve. "I don't want to fight you, Claire," he admitted quietly as he set the doll down. Claire's expression hardened. "You don't get to say that. You had your chance to fight for me. You didn't." Daniel exhaled sharply. "I know." Silence stretched between them. For the first time, there was no anger, no walls, just two people standing in the middle of a tiny apartment, trying to navigate the wreckage of what they used to be. Hours later, Daniel sat on the couch, watching Claire as she slept on the other side of the room. She looked so peaceful, so different from the woman he had pushed away. His chest ached. He had thought that money and power would make him invincible, but he had been wrong. Because right now, the only thing he wanted, the only thing he had ever truly wanted, was lying just a few feet away, and he had already lost her. maybe for good. Daniel leaned back against the couch, running a hand down his face. This wasn't just about custody anymore. This wasn't just about being a father. It was about being the man Claire had deserved all along, and he wasn't going to stop until he proved that to her, even if it took the rest of his life. Section 6. Daniel woke up to the smell of coffee and the soft sound of Claire moving around the kitchen. For a brief, disoriented moment, he forgot where he was. His usual morning routine involved waking up in his penthouse, checking his emails before even getting out of bed, and having his assistant bring him coffee. But today was different. Today, he was in Claire's apartment. Spending the night here had been a test, and he had barely survived, but he wasn't going to let Claire see that. He sat up, stretching his sore muscles from sleeping on the couch, and glanced toward the kitchen. Claire stood by the counter, pouring herself a cup of coffee, her long hair pulled into a loose ponytail. She looked normal, happy, as if she had completely moved on from the life they had shared. And for the first time it hit him. Maybe she really had. Maybe he was fighting for something that no longer existed. But then she turned, her eyes locking onto his, and for the briefest moment, he saw something flicker in her gaze. Uncertainty, hesitation, hope, and that was all the confirmation he needed. She still felt something. Now he just had to make sure it was enough. Claire set a cup of coffee on the table in front of him. "You survived the night," she said, crossing her arms. Daniel smirked, picking up the cup. "Barely." Claire rolled her eyes, but there was the tiniest hint of amusement in her expression. "You don't have to stay," she said, leaning against the counter. "You proved your point." Daniel studied her. "Is that what you think this is? A game?" Claire exhaled sharply, looking away. "Isn't it? You only care because you feel guilty." Daniel's grip tightened around his coffee cup. "I care because you're carrying my child." Claire flinched at his words. Daniel set his cup down, standing. "I messed up, Claire, I know that, but I'm not going anywhere." Claire swallowed, her posture stiff. "And what happens when the novelty wears off? When this becomes too real?" Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Then I'll still be here." Claire held his gaze for a long moment, searching for any sign of deception. And for the first time in their relationship, she didn't find one. Later that afternoon, Claire met with her attorney. "You need to be careful," Melanie warned, flipping through the custody documents. "Daniel Gray doesn't lose." Claire sighed, rubbing her temples. "I know." Melanie leaned forward. "But you're not the same woman who walked away from him. You have power now." Claire let out a dry laugh. "What power? He has an army of lawyers, unlimited resources, and a name that can destroy anyone who gets in his way." Melanie shook her head. "He's not fighting for a company this time. He's fighting for a family, and that makes him vulnerable." Claire frowned. "How?" Melanie smirked. "Because this isn't about winning. It's about proving himself to you. And if there's one thing I know about Daniel Gray, it's that he only fights when he has something to lose." Claire exhaled, leaning back in her chair. She hated that Melanie was right. Daniel wasn't just trying to win custody. He was trying to win her back, and that terrified her more than anything. The next day, Daniel showed up at Claire's apartment again. She hadn't invited him, hadn't expected him, and yet there he was, standing in her doorway like he belonged there. "What are you doing here?" she asked, crossing her arms. Daniel held up a bag of groceries. "You eat like a college student. Figured I'd fix that." Claire narrowed her eyes. "You don't cook." Daniel smirked. "I do now." She hesitated but eventually stepped aside, letting him in. Daniel set the bag down on the counter and started unpacking ingredients. "You should sit down. Pregnancy and stress don't mix." Claire huffed. "Since when do you know anything about pregnancy?" Daniel paused, then looked at her. "Since I started researching everything I could about it." Claire's breath caught. She didn't know what to say to that, and so she said nothing. Instead, she watched as Daniel clumsily attempted to cook dinner, burning the first batch of vegetables and almost setting off the smoke alarm. Claire shook her head, biting back a smile. "This is painful to watch," Daniel groaned. "I don't understand how I can handle billion-dollar mergers but can't cook a damn meal." Claire chuckled, stepping in beside him. "Here, let me." For the next hour, they stood side by side in the kitchen, something that felt almost normal, like they were just two people cooking dinner, like they weren't drowning in years of hurt and broken promises, like maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. That night, Daniel stayed again, not because Claire asked him to, Not because he forced his way in, but because for the first time in a long time, it felt right. He slept on the couch, listening to the soft hum of the city outside. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel empty. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. With her, with their child. And this time he wasn't going to let go. Not without a fight. Section 7. The morning light filtered through the apartment's curtains, casting a golden hue across the living room. Daniel stretched, his body sore from another night on the couch, but he didn't care. Waking up in Claire's home, knowing he was even slightly closer to her, made every uncomfortable night worth it. Claire walked into the room, a warm cup of tea in her hands, pausing slightly when she saw him awake. "You're still here," she muttered, taking a sip of her tea. Daniel smirked, running a hand through his disheveled hair, starting to get used to it. Claire rolled her eyes but didn't argue. Instead, she placed her tea on the coffee table and moved toward the kitchen, glancing at the time. "You don't have work today?" she asked. "I cleared my schedule." Claire blinked, looking back at him. "You cleared your schedule? For what?" Daniel shrugged. "Thought I'd spend the day with you." Claire scoffed, shaking her head. "I don't need a babysitter, Daniel." He smirked. "No, but you do need to eat breakfast, and I have a plan." She narrowed her eyes at him suspiciously. "What kind of plan? Ever been to the farmer's market?" Claire blinked, completely thrown off. Of all the things she expected him to say, that was not on the list. "You want to take me to a farmer's market?" she repeated slowly. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I read somewhere that fresh air is good for pregnant women, and fresh produce." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Since when do you read pregnancy articles?" Daniel gave her a knowing look. "Since I found out I was going to be a father." Her heart clenched at his words, but she quickly masked her emotions with a scoff. "Fine, but if I get tired, I'm going home." Daniel smirked. "Fair enough." The farmer's market was bustling with activity. Stalls lined the cobblestone streets, each one filled with colorful fruits, vegetables, and handmade goods. Claire couldn't remember the last time she'd gone somewhere like this, somewhere that felt so normal. She glanced at Daniel, half expecting him to look out of place, but to her surprise, he seemed completely at ease. He wasn't barking orders into his phone or checking his watch. He was present. "You look surprised," he noted, handing her a small basket. Claire smirked. "I just never imagined you at a farmer's market. It's kind of amusing." Daniel chuckled. "I can be full of surprises." She rolled her eyes but took the basket, wandering toward a stall filled with fresh strawberries. As she picked up a few, she caught Daniel watching her, a soft expression on his face. "What?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Daniel shrugged. "Nothing, just, I like seeing you like this." Claire's heart skipped a beat, but she quickly ignored it, moving to another stall. She wouldn't fall for him again. She couldn't. After spending the morning at the market, Daniel convinced Claire to have lunch at a nearby cafe. They sat outside, enjoying the cool breeze, and for the first time in years, their conversation felt easy. They talked about everything except the past. Daniel learned Claire still loved books, still drank tea instead of coffee, and still had the same sarcastic wit that made him fall for her years ago. Claire learned that Daniel had started painting again, something he used to love but abandoned when work consumed his life. It was strange. Sitting across from him, laughing, teasing, it almost felt like old times. Almost. But then reality crashed down on her like a tidal wave. She was pregnant, and he had broken her heart once before. Would she really let him do it again? Later that evening, Claire sat on the couch, absent-mindedly rubbing her belly as she scrolled through emails on her laptop. Daniel walked in, drying his hands with a kitchen towel. "Dinner's almost ready." Claire looked up, slightly amused. "You cooked?" Daniel smirked. "I followed a recipe, no fires this time." She chuckled but set her laptop aside, stretching slightly. "I should probably start getting used to this," she murmured. Daniel frowned. "Used to what?" Claire sighed, her gaze distant. "Someone else being around. For so long, it's just been me." Daniel's expression softened. He walked over, sitting beside her. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," he said quietly. Claire glanced at him, hesitating. "And what happens when you change your mind?" Daniel exhaled sharply. "Claire, I won't." She let out a dry laugh. "You say that now, but things change. People change." Daniel reached out, gently placing a hand over hers. Then let me prove to you that I'm not going anywhere. Claire swallowed, searching his eyes for any sign of deception. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't find one. And that terrified her more than anything. That night after dinner, Claire found herself standing outside on the balcony, staring at the city skyline. Daniel joined her, leaning against the railing. It's been a while since I just existed, he admitted. Claire glanced at him. Existed? He nodded. For years, I buried myself in work. I thought if I kept moving, I wouldn't have to think about everything I lost. Claire looked away. And now? Daniel sighed. Now I realized that the one thing I lost that mattered the most was you. Her heart clenched painfully, but she forced herself to stay composed. It's not that simple, she murmured. I know, he admitted, but that doesn't mean I'm giving up. Claire exhaled, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. For years, she had convinced herself that she didn't need Daniel, that she could do this on her own. But now, for the first time, she wasn't so sure, and that terrified her more than anything. Section 8. The days passed in a strange, unspoken truce. Daniel was still staying on the couch, still showing up to take Claire to doctor's appointments, and still proving in little ways that he wasn't leaving this time. Claire hated how much she noticed, how much she wanted to believe him. She wasn't ready to admit it, not to herself, and definitely not to him, but a part of her was softening. And that was dangerous, because falling for Daniel again would mean trusting him again. And trust was something she couldn't afford to give away so easily. One afternoon, Daniel returned from running errands with a few bags in his hands. Claire raised an eyebrow as he walked into the apartment, setting them down on the counter. What's all that? She asked, eyeing the assortment of items. Baby stuff, he said casually, pulling out tiny onesies, soft blankets, and a stuffed bear. Claire froze. Daniel, noticing her silence, turned to look at her. I thought it was time we started getting ready. We? She repeated, her voice quieter now. Daniel hesitated, then stepped closer. Claire, I know you've been doing this alone for months, but I want to be here. I want to be a part of this. Claire let out a shaky breath. You can't just show up with baby clothes and expect everything to be okay. I know that, he admitted, but I also know that I can't change the past. I can only show you that I'm serious about the future. Claire looked down at the tiny onesie in his hands. It was soft, white, with a little bear on the front. Something in her chest tightened. This is real for you now, she murmured. Daniel exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. It's always been real, Claire. I was just too much of an idiot to see it before. She swallowed hard, willing herself not to cry. For so long, she had prepared for this baby alone, thinking she had no choice. Now Daniel was standing here, telling her she didn't have to. She wanted to believe him. But what if she let him in, only for him to walk away again? What if she let herself hope and got hurt all over again? That night, Claire found herself staring at the crib in the spare room. She had spent weeks putting it together alone, assembling it piece by piece, knowing that no one else would do it for her. And now Daniel was here, hovering, waiting, trying. She sighed and walked into the living room where Daniel was reading a parenting book on the couch. She smirked. You really think a book is going to prepare you for a baby? Daniel looked up, giving her a lopsided grin. Figured it was worth a shot. Claire hesitated, then took a deep breath. Do you want to see the nursery? Daniel blinked in surprise, then quickly nodded. Yeah, of course. She led him down the hall, pushing open the door. The room was simple but warm. Soft blue walls, a rocking chair in the corner, a shelf filled with books she had been collecting. Daniel stepped inside, taking everything in. You did this all yourself? He asked, his voice unreadable. Claire crossed her arms. Who else was going to do it? Daniel clenched his jaw, guilt flashing across his face. Claire, don't, she interrupted. I don't want an apology. I want to make sure you understand that I've built a life without you. Daniel turned to her, his eyes dark with emotion. I know that, and I admire the hell out of you for it. Claire looked away, swallowing hard. Daniel took a step closer. But I also want to be a part of this life, Claire. If you'll let me. She wanted to tell him no. She wanted to push him away. But when she looked up at him, she realized she couldn't. Not anymore. The next morning, Claire woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet humming coming from the kitchen. She rubbed her eyes, groggy, and patted out to find Daniel cooking breakfast. You cook now? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Daniel smirked. Not well, but I'm learning. Claire sat at the counter watching as he fumbled with the spatula. He looked so out of place in her kitchen, yet at the same time, he didn't. It was unsettling, and comforting, and terrifying. She was starting to let him in again, and she wasn't sure if that was a mistake. Later that day, Claire went to another doctor's appointment. Daniel was there, of course, sitting beside her in the waiting room, flipping through a parenting magazine with a bemused expression. "This stuff is terrifying," he muttered, holding up a page on labor and delivery. Claire chuckled. "Welcome to my world." When her name was called, she stood up, expecting to walk into the exam room alone, like she always had, but Daniel followed. The doctor smiled as they entered. "Looks like you brought Dad today." Claire stiffened slightly, but Daniel only smiled. Wouldn't miss it. She didn't know why that made her chest tighten. The ultrasound started and the screen flickered to life, revealing the tiny shape of their baby. Daniel sucked in a sharp breath. "Wow," he whispered. Claire turned to look at him. His expression was raw, unguarded, completely in awe. It was the first time she had ever seen him this way, and for the first time she realized something. Daniel might have broken her heart once, but he loved this baby, and maybe, just maybe, he was telling the truth when he said he wasn't leaving. That night, Claire sat alone on the balcony, staring at the city lights. She was falling, not just for Daniel, but for the idea of them again. And that scared her more than anything, because if she let herself believe in him, if she let herself hope, what would happen if he let her down again? Would she survive it? Daniel walked out, leaning against the railing beside her. "Penny for your thoughts?" Claire sighed. "Just thinking." "About?" She hesitated. "Us." Daniel didn't say anything for a moment, then turned to her. "Do you want there to be an us again?" Claire swallowed hard. "I don't know." Daniel reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Then let me show you, Claire. Let me prove that I won't walk away this time." Her heart pounded. She wanted to believe him. She really, really did. But could she? Section 9. The next few days passed in a delicate balance between familiarity and uncertainty. Daniel was present, undeniably, unshakably present, but Claire wasn't sure what to do with that. For months she had built a world where she was alone, where she relied on no one but herself. Now Daniel was slipping into the cracks of that world, filling spaces she had long since convinced herself didn't need filling, and that terrified her. She wasn't sure which was worse, the idea of letting him in again or the fear of what would happen if she did, and he still walked away. One evening, Daniel was setting the table while Claire stirred a pot of soup on the stove. It was almost domestic, too easy, too comfortable. "This is nice," Daniel murmured, breaking the silence. Claire glanced at him warily. "What is?" "This, United States, dinner, normal things." She frowned, stirring absently. "Normal things aren't really our strong suit." Daniel smirked, but there was something serious in his gaze. "I want them to be." Claire swallowed hard. "Daniel, I know." He cut in gently. "I know it's not that simple. I know I don't get to just waltz in here and act like the past doesn't exist. But I want this, Claire. I want to be here." She didn't reply, because if she did, she wasn't sure what would come out. That night, Claire lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. Not with the way her mind raced, tangled in the past, the present, and the impossible question of the future. Eventually, she gave up and climbed out of bed, padding quietly to the nursery. She hadn't even turned on the light when she realized she wasn't alone. Daniel was there, sitting in the rocking chair, staring at the crib with an unreadable expression. Claire hesitated in the doorway. "You okay?" Daniel let out a breath. "I can't believe this is real." Claire's chest tightened. "I spent years thinking I had everything," he continued. "That my career, my company, my success was enough. But none of it feels like it matters anymore." Claire's fingers curled around the doorframe. "Daniel, I missed so much," he murmured, "and I'll never forgive myself for that." She wanted to tell him that she didn't want his guilt, that it didn't change anything, but she couldn't, because a part of her had needed to hear those words more than she had realized. The next morning, Daniel was gone before she woke up. For a brief, irrational moment, panic tightened in her chest. Had he left? Had this all been temporary? But when she walked into the kitchen, there was a note on the counter. "Had an early meeting. Didn't want to wake you. Coffee's in the pot. I'll be back soon. -D." Claire exhaled slowly. He was coming back. Why was that so hard to believe? That afternoon, Claire went to her prenatal class. She had gone alone every time before, watching as other mothers sat beside their partners, watching them share the experience in a way she never thought she'd have. But this time, Daniel showed up. He slid into the chair beside her, earning a few curious glances from the other women in the room. "You don't have to be here," she whispered. Daniel tilted his head, smirking. "I want to be." Claire wasn't sure what to do with that. The instructor walked them through various breathing techniques, guiding them through labor positions. Claire had done this before, but Daniel looked thoroughly out of his element. She bit back a smile as he attempted to follow along. "You okay over there?" she teased. Daniel shot her a look. "I negotiate billion-dollar deals. This should not be this complicated." Claire chuckled, and for the first time she let herself think, maybe this could work. Maybe. After class, Daniel drove her home. It was quiet, comfortable, until he spoke. "I put in a request for paternity leave." Claire nearly choked. "What?" Daniel kept his eyes on the road. "I want to be there when the baby is born. I don't want to miss anything." Claire's fingers curled into her lap. "Daniel, that's not necessary." "It is to me." She had no idea what to say to that, so she said nothing. That night, Daniel stayed late at the office. Claire wasn't expecting him back until much later, so when she heard the door open, she was caught off guard. "Hey," he murmured, stepping inside. "Hey," she said softly. "I thought you'd be out later." Daniel exhaled, raking a hand through his hair. "I didn't want to be." Something in her chest ached. She wasn't ready to believe him, but she wanted to. A few nights later, Claire woke up to a sharp pain. She sat up, wincing, her hands flying to her stomach. Something was wrong. Her breath hitched. No, not yet. She wasn't ready. She swung her legs over the bed, but before she could stand, another pain tore through her. Fear shot through her veins. She needed to get to the hospital. Now, she fumbled for her phone, dialing the only number that made sense. Daniel answered on the second ring. "Claire?" She was shaking. "Something's wrong." There was a beat of silence, and then, "I'm on my way." 15 minutes later, Daniel burst into the apartment. His face was pale, his tie loosened, his expression frantic. "Are you okay?" he demanded. Claire clenched her jaw, trying to breathe through another sharp pain. "I don't know," she admitted. Daniel didn't hesitate. He scooped her up into his arms, carrying her to the car. "I've got you," he murmured. And this time, Claire believed him. The hospital was a blur. Tests, monitors, the steady, anxious rhythm of her heartbeat echoing in her ears. "It's early," she whispered, gripping Daniel's hand. Daniel squeezed back. "But everything's going to be fine." She didn't know if that was true, but for the first time she wanted to believe it. They kept her overnight for observation. Daniel stayed the whole time. When she woke up the next morning, he was still there, watching, waiting, protecting. As they left the hospital, Daniel helped her into the car, his expression unreadable. When they got home, Claire hesitated at the door. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. Daniel stepped closer. "Do what?" "This," she whispered. "Us." Daniel swallowed hard. "We figure it out, together." Claire closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself hope. Section 10. The days that followed were a quiet storm of uncertainty. Claire was discharged from the hospital with strict instructions to rest, and Daniel made it his personal mission to ensure she followed them. She tried to protest. She was used to doing everything alone, but Daniel wouldn't hear it. "If you need something, I'll get it," he insisted. She frowned. "Daniel, I'm not incapable." "I know," he cut in, leveling her with a look. "But you don't have to do this alone anymore." Claire opened her mouth to argue, but the words died in her throat, because as much as she wanted to deny it, a part of her didn't want to be alone anymore. That night, Claire lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to do with all of this. Daniel had been back in her life for weeks now. He had shown up for every doctor's appointment, been by her side through every scare, and made it clear that he wasn't going anywhere. But was that enough? Could she really trust him? Did she even want to? Her heart warred with her head tangled in old wounds and new uncertainties. She closed her eyes. She needed time, but she wasn't sure how much she had left. The next morning, Claire found Daniel in the kitchen, making coffee. It was almost normal, almost easy. She leaned against the counter, watching him. He glanced up, offering a small smile. "Morning." She hesitated. "Morning." A beat of silence stretched between them. Then, "I was thinking," Daniel started, "about the baby's room." Claire stiffened. What about it? I want to help, he said simply. Her fingers curled against the counter. Daniel, I know you have everything covered, he cut in gently. But I want to be involved. I want to do this with you. Claire swallowed hard. For months she had pictured herself doing this alone, but now she wasn't sure she wanted to. That afternoon, Daniel took her to a baby store. She wasn't sure why she agreed. Maybe because a part of her wanted to see if he was serious. Maybe because a part of her wanted him to be. She watched as he browsed through tiny clothes, his brows furrowing in concentration. You're taking this very seriously, she remarked. Daniel shot her a look. This is serious. Claire pressed her lips together, something tight in her chest. Maybe it was. A week later, Daniel insisted on helping build the crib. Claire sat on the floor, watching him struggle with the instructions. You're a billionaire CEO, she teased. You should be able to handle this. Daniel shot her a dry look. Do you want to do it? She smirked. No, this is much more fun. He sighed, shaking his head, but there was a ghost of a smile on his lips. And Claire? For the first time in a long time, she felt okay. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Daniel turned to her. I want to be in the delivery room. Claire blinked. What? I want to be there when the baby is born, he said firmly. If you'll let me. Claire's heart pounded. This was real. He was serious, and she wasn't sure what to say, so she nodded. And that was enough. The final weeks of Claire's pregnancy passed in a slow, uncertain blur. Daniel was always there, always checking in, always showing up. He drove her to appointments, made sure she ate, helped her with things she would have never asked for help with before. And slowly, Claire let herself believe. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in this anymore. Then the night came. Claire jolted awake, a sharp pain ripping through her. Her breath hitched. It was too soon. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, gripping her stomach. Another pain shot through her, and this time she gasped. Oh God, it was happening. She fumbled for her phone, but before she could dial, Daniel's voice filled the doorway. Claire? She looked up, eyes wide. It's time. Daniel's face paled. Then he snapped into action. Okay, let's go. The hospital was a blur. Pain, voices, the rush of nurses and doctors. Claire clutched Daniel's hand, gasping through another contraction. It hurts, she whispered. Daniel pressed a kiss to her forehead. You're doing amazing. She squeezed his hand tighter. For the first time, she wasn't afraid, because Daniel was there. Hours later, a cry filled the room. A baby's cry. Claire sobbed as the doctor placed a tiny, wriggling body in her arms. A baby girl. She was perfect. Daniel sat beside her, staring at their daughter with something raw and unfiltered in his eyes. She's beautiful, he whispered. Claire looked up at him, and for the first time she knew they were a family. Days later, as Claire sat in the nursery, rocking their daughter, Daniel knelt beside her. I know I don't deserve it, he murmured, but I love you, Claire. Her breath hitched. I love you, he repeated, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving it. Tears slipped down her cheeks. And this time, when he reached for her, she didn't pull away. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. What would you have done in Claire's shoes? Let me know in the comments.